Hello again, I am Blunty, and that right there is the Retro Trio console that I reviewed in the video that preceded this one. If you missed it, it's linked in the description and all that kind of stuff, of course, but the short version is, it's a 3-in-1 classic retro console machine that will stuck in your games from the NES, Super NES, and Mega Drive, each also known in alternative parts of the world as the Famicom, Super Famicom, and Sega Genesis, and I found it to be damn good at what it does. But in this video, I wanted to dig into the games I used to test it, most of which I gathered on a recent trip to Japan, a place perfect for hunting for retro games from the ancient days where ROM chips ruled the earth and the tiny mammal-like creatures that would one day evolve into optical drive skittered about in the shadows. The natural starting point here is of course with the earliest ancestor represented amongst this group, the Famicom, a machine that, once it had a slight redesign, hit the West in what would become a game system so iconic, so pervasive, and such a part of our gaming culture zeitgeist that for at least 2 decades after its birth, the uninformed outsiders who had not earned the mantle of gamer would call playing any game on any console or system as playing Nintendo. The Nintendo Entertainment System, the NES for short, or NES, the machine that saved gaming from its first and very nearly completely catastrophic crash in the early 80s. So first up, the imaginatively titled Golf for the NES, featuring a golfer with quite a strong resemblance to another red-hatted, moustache-wearing, large-nosed Nintendo character. It hit the world in 1984, and for some reason many retro gamers consider this as one of the classics, but I think it's catastrophically bad. There's no music, and the sound effects are the most basic you can imagine, and even for 1984 the controller's clumsy, primitive, awkward, not really planned out that well, it makes no logical sense, and either I suck ass at it beyond all reason, or the controls and what passes for ball physics are just sloppy horse poo. Par for me in this game is some kind of theoretical concept yet to be proven by physicists. And I did play this when it first came out, but I hated it so much it put me off all golf games until about 1990 when I discovered Link's The Challenge of Golf for my PC. But that is a completely different story. Super Mario Brothers. I shouldn't even need to say anything about this game at all. You all know it already. Even those of you too young to have ever played it on an actual NES for real will know it. Some of you may have even played it on an emulator, or in Nintendo's virtual consoles, or in a port, or a remake. There's a bewildering number of ways you possibly could have experienced this game since it first came out. But here it is, the original, in fact, the Japanese version, September 13th, 1985, a date of gaming trivia that's been stuck in my head for I have no idea how long. But it was a Friday, and it was 28 years ago, and I was 7. But Super Mario Bros. Didn't actually land on Australian shores until 2 years later, in 1987, and gamers today think they've got it rough when they have to wait a few extra weeks or even a month or two between a game's release in various regions. Ha! It is of course one of, if not the most influential games of all time, and for almost 30 years it held the title of the best-selling game of all time. Those of you who remember the bug trick and how to get to the glitched minus world can go get a cookie now. Sadly, I was unable to find a copy of the true Super Mario Bros. 2, the real Japanese one, the one that was later repackaged for the West and called the Lost Levels, not the wackadoo remake thingy we got called was Super Mario Bros. 2. But I did find Super Mario Bros. 3. It hit Japan in 1988 and the West in 1990 and 1991, depending on where you lived. It too quickly became one of the best-selling games of all time, and it's one of my personal favourites as it introduced my favourite power-ups, the Super Leaf and the Tanuki Suit. And it's also responsible for bringing several of the now standard power-ups and items into the Mario universe. The 1-up mushrooms first appeared here. The warp whistle, the ground pound move is seen first here too. It is my personal favourite of the NES-based Mario games, and it influenced all the Mario games that followed it significantly. By the way, you ever notice the drop shadow on the 3 in the title screen? Galaxian. It first hit the world as an arcade game in 1979, and if you think it looks like Space Invaders jazzed up a bit, that's pretty much exactly what it was. And it holds its place in gaming history for one dazzling reason. Believe it or not, this was the first arcade game in colour. 5 years later, in 1984, it got its Famicom port. And here's the interesting tidbit that made me snatch it up as soon as I saw it, buried in a box, rattling around with dozens of other old Famicom cartridges. As popular as Galaxian was, this version never actually saw a release outside of Japan. This game exists only for the Famicom. It never got shifted over to the NES for a Western release. Now, it's not especially rare, which is why it only cost me like 500 yen or so, about $5, but it is special, and for me, worth collecting for its place in history and this version's Japanese-only existence. Like Space Invaders, you could only have one of your lasers or bullets or whatever on screen at a time, and you had to wait to hit something or your mist to pass off the screen before firing again. But unlike Space Invaders, enemy ships here would break formation to swarm and dive at you in set patterns. Once you'd successfully destroyed all of the alien ships, a new fleet would just replace them. It was just a single screen shooter, and the only real goal was to stay alive and rack up higher and higher scores. And it is still an excellent game, even 3.5 decades since it first hit arcades. It holds its own as a game worth playing, a true classic. Super Xevious Gampono Nazo. I think that's how it's pronounced anyway, in its shining gold cartridge. Once upon a time there was an arcade game called Xevious, a classic vertical shooter. Then came Super Xevious, which was essentially the exact same game, but was made harder and much less forgiving for the hardcore players. And it threw in some new enemies and challenges for the ride too. There was even some enemies that, should you succeed in destroying them, your reward, as it were, would be to have your score reset to 0. If the troll face internet meme had existed in 1984, this would have been the game it was invented for. But in 1986, Super Xevious Gampono Nazo was released for the Famicom. It translated, it's Super Xevious Riddle of the Gamp, and it's a sequel. It never really reached the heights of its arcade forebears, and it was somewhat eclipsed by Gradius, Galaxian's own follow-up. But aside from its flashy case, it is interesting for 2 more reasons. First, like Galaxian, it never saw a Western release, so it's another Famicom exclusive game the NES never ever saw. Secondly, it fiddled with the scrolling shooter format in an interesting way. In this game, you had to solve the riddle of how to end a stage. You had to meet certain criteria before you could complete a level. Sometimes it was just a matter of bombing all of the ground targets, other stages were much trickier, and some were downright obscure. But fail to meet the requirement and the stage would actually infinitely loop upon itself, and every time you fail, and every time the stage is forced to loop, it gets harder. It is not a great game, and it's not even close to being the best Xevious game out there, but it is quite playable, and it is special in its own way. Dragon Ball Z3 Resin Jinzao Ningen, I think is how you're supposed to pronounce it. Sorry if you actually speak Japanese and I just murdered your native tongue. Anyway, I picked it up for just 250 yen on the hopes that it was some kind of interesting fighter game. You know, safe enough assumption I thought. It's a Dragon Ball Z game, it's got to be about fighting, yeah? What it is, however, is an RPG-style game with turn-based combat and some kind of card-based system which I have absolutely zero idea how to actually use. From what I've been able to find out, it came out in '92, the title translates as Dragon Ball Z3 Hot Battle Artificial Humans, but I suspect a more appropriate translation for artificial humans would be androids, seeing as that's how they were referred to in the English version of the anime. In trying to find out more about this game, I found out that there is a hacked, fan-translated ROM version out there, which is subtitled simply Killer Androids. It seems to start off just at the end of the Frieza saga, and your party consists of the appropriate characters for that time frame, and of course, as the name suggests, the story revolves around the Android saga, which probably means at least Imperfect Cell is somewhere in here too. But as it's not the wordless fighter I'd gambled on when I spotted the label art, and being unable to actually read Japanese, I'm afraid here is where my story with it ends. Perhaps I'll need to find a hardcore Dragon Ball Z fan to pass it on to. And last, but far from least from my small haul of Famicom and NES games, is this, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2. Now, I had expected this to be one of my favourite arcade brawlers of all time, the game that carried the subtitle of Turtles in Time. But I was tricked. You see, while Japan got the same Ninja Turtle games as we did, I later found out that the first game had a name change to Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Super Kame Ninja, which then made marking the second Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Turtles in Time, as Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 kind of redundant, because the original now carried its own subtitle instead, which then meant that Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3, The Manhattan Project, was instead marked as Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles number 2, to link it as the sequel to Turtles in Time. Confused yet? Well, I was when I booted up the game for the first time and found out the error that I'd made in my ignorance of this obscure and convoluted little factoid. But I guess it's nice to know Japan got their game numbers screwed up sometimes too, just like we did in the West with the Super Mario titles and the Final Fantasy games in particular. But the fun part of all this is this. I have never actually played this particular game. There was never an arcade game version of it as there was for the previous two games, which were based off of the arcade versions. This one was created specifically for the NES. I can't even recall if it was ever even released in Australia. My Googling has come up empty on this fact. I can't recall ever seeing it on shelves at the time, and certainly none of my friends ever owned it either. So, by pure chance, I'm getting to play a Ninja Turtles beat-em-up that I never got to back in '92 when it was first released. It's like a fun little time capsule. Now, graphically and mechanically, it seems to be built on the exact same game engine as Turtles in Time, and it plays almost identically too. There's new enemies, of course, and a new special move for each turtle. But again, being unable to actually read Japanese, I'm lost on the plot and dialogue stuff, but, you know, in games like this, that really doesn't matter much, does it? Just go to the right and sometimes down and kick the ever-loving crap out of every single thing you see moving around. Job done. Besides, from what I can tell, the plot is the same as it always is for the Turtles of this era. Shredder is effing up Shiz in some ridiculously super villainy way, and the only way to stop him is to go and find him and kick his faceplate inside out. And I'll be saving this particular game for a rainy day to sit down and give it a proper playthrough. A bit of Googling revealed that Electronic Gaming Monthly, which back then was the best gaming magazine around in my opinion, over the years as magazines died, it kind of morphed into GameSpot.com and OneUp.com and eventually was swallowed up entirely by this CNET monster. But anyway, back then they called it an excellent, well-rounded game, and even awarded it the best NES game of 1992. So it turns out it was a really nice find, even if I thought I was buying its predecessor, which I loved so much. Surprises and silver linings, I'm calling this one a win. Anyway, that's it for the NES and Famicom haul. Next time I'll be digging into the Super Nintendo stuff. I've got some classics there too. And then after that, you Sega peeps get your props as I splash about in the Mega Drive pool for a bit. But thanks for watching, I am Blunty, and I'll catch you next time.